It's the Metro on WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham. During the Great Depression, auto workers organized a march from Detroit to the Fort Rouge factory in Dearborn. Thousands of people participated in the demonstration. The event is now known as the Ford Hunger March, and it was one of the most significant events leading to the creation of the United Auto Workers Union. Today, Friends of Rouge and the Fort Rouge Gateway Partnership joined forces to construct the Fort Street Bridge and Interpretive Park. It is a way to celebrate those who fought for workers' rights and commemorates a pivotal moment in Union history. The first phase of the park project is already complete, and construction for the second phase of the project has begun. Joining us now to discuss the importance of this park and the history it honors is Paul Draus. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan-Dearborn and a board member of Friends of Rouge. Professor Draus, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Of course. So I just want to briefly touch on the history of the Hunger March. It's the Great Depression, and many people are laid off. What factors inspired this march to take place?
Well, as you mentioned, it was the depths of the Great Depression, and so you had a lot of people out of work. People are being evicted from their homes. The Fort Rouge plant was still employing a lot of workers, although he had laid off a lot of workers, and so this was an organized attempt of by the Detroit unemployed councils, who were, a lot of them were connected with the Communist Party at the time, but also other groups. They got together to march from Detroit to Dearborn to deliver a list of 14 demands to Henry Ford. Basically, the demands included like hiring more unemployed workers. There was demands related to housing, related to actually a lot of other issues that we would consider to be, ahead of their time in terms of things that we might anticipate that union workers would later expect. Things like controlling of speed ups, because they would do a lot of speed ups on the lines and things like this. There was also notably a call for ends to racial discrimination in hiring. So the Ford Hunger March was significant not only because of the demands placed on Henry Ford at the time and the reaction to the Ford Hunger March, but it was notably an integrated march. And so some of the signs from that day said, "Negro and white unite," for example.
And when we think about that particular time, because a lot of us, even yesterday we had a conversation about the auto industry here, but a lot of us fail to understand that it was very multicultural, it was very diverse folks working within Henry Ford and the Ford factory. So could you talk about just the makeup at that time and how it was such a catch-all, I guess you can say, for all of the workers' issues and making sure that everyone was heard?
So I have to give credit to people that I've learned from on this issue, and there are a lot. And I really want to call out actually Bill Cohen right now. He was a former employee of the United Auto Workers, Local 600. Bill passed away recently, so that's why I wanted to mention Bill. But actually, one way you can learn about this is just going to see the Detroit Industry murals by Diego Rivera and the Detroit Institute of Arts, and you can see all the different cultures of people that were working in the Rouge plant. But one thing that Bill pointed out to me, because they have a reproduction of the industry mural at Local 600 in Dearborn, is that there was segregation in terms of who was working where, and that Ford actually had a strategy around hiring people of many different cultures. He liked to put people with other people who didn't speak the same language in order to sort of prevent them from collaborating and organizing. And then you also saw more of the workers of color, whether they were Black workers, Latino workers, were often put in certain areas of the plant where the work was seen as being sort of much harder and and grittier and dirtier. So there was, even though it was a very multicultural environment, and Ford hired obviously the Arab community in Dearborn is there in part because Ford was hiring people from the Arab world. There was also these kind of strategies that were employed in order to keep the workforce from organizing, which Ford had resisted, vehemently. Mm-hmm. And of course did on that day in 1932.
Yes, the outcome of the march, of what happened once they reached their destination that day.
So the accounts are that the march was peaceful began in Detroit, in southwest Detroit, where the Fort Street Bridge Park is now. It went up Miller Road to Dearborn. When they reached the Dearborn border, they started to, and they were actually accompanied by Detroit police up to that point. the mayor of Detroit was Frank Murphy, right? And he had sort of allowed the march to go forward. They knew about it. He didn't give it a permit, but he allowed it to go forward. And the Detroit police were actually trying to ensure the peacefulness of the march. But when they reached Dearborn, there were Ford security and Dearborn police there. And they started with firing tear gas and then water cannons, and the workers kept coming. And then shots were fired into the crowd. And I think hundreds of people were injured. 5 people died, not all that day. 3 died that day, 2 died later. Curtis Williams, the one African-American worker that was killed, he died, I think, months later from injuries sustained on that day. And the others there were 3 Joes, actually. There was Joe York, Joel Bussell, and Joe de Blasio. And then Coleman Lenny. Coleman Lenny was the other one. One of them, I think Joe York, was only about 19 years old. Wow. But many people were injured, and then, of course, this turned into a big black eye for the Ford Motor Company. Although at the time, the media was largely against the march, seeing it as attached to the Communist Party and so on.
So it was demonized.
It was demonized, but there were probably about 3,000 people that marched that day. But for the funeral procession, there were more than 30,000 people that came out. And so it became it really tarnished Ford's reputation. Who up until the 1930s, he was seen as kind of like a rock star, of industry in the United States, could do no wrong. And interestingly enough, I found out in learning more about the Hunger March was that the industry mural itself was probably an outcome of the Ford Hunger March, because Edsel Ford, the son of Henry Ford, was seeking to repair the public image of Ford Motor Company in the wake of the Ford Hunger March. So he hired, this communist muralist from Mexico who brought his wife Frida Kahlo to Detroit and painted this mural, which was itself, of course, controversial because of the depictions of labor relations and of Henry Ford and so on. So, it really is tied in and woven into the fabric of Detroit's history and culture, but for a long time the story was sort of neglected and forgotten. It was part of the reason why, when we had the chance to, with the replacement of the Fort Street Bridge Park in 2012, there was opportunity to commemorate the Ford Hunger March in a more a meaningful way, or in a bigger way. Previously, there had been a plaque on the old Fort Street Bridge, which was because of UAW Local 600 had gotten that plaque created. But with that bridge coming down, they had to remove the old plaque. And so we engaged with the Michigan Department of Transportation. It was a whole group of us, Motor City's National Heritage Area,
who we spoke with yesterday.
Okay,
yes.
And they led the first phase of the Fort Street Bridge Park. They were the fiduciaries, and of course, this fits in their mission of telling the labor history story. And so that was the whole focus of phase 1 of the park, was to commemorate that history. So now, if you go to the Fort Street Bridge Park, we have a commemorative sculpture, which was fashioned from the pieces of the old Fort Street Bridge. And there's a poem on the structure, which is called March On. And so we do a festival every year, like a music festival in commemoration of the Hunger March called March On. We do it every year in March. And so there's a poem there that we composed together as a group, the Fort Rouge Gateway Partnership. Do you want to hear it?
Oh, please.
So it's called March On. It was March of 1932, the depths of depression and thousands of souls, women and men, young and old, crossed the bridge and braved the cold to deliver a list of 14 demands to the Rouge plant just up the road. It was a bitter mile. Dozens were shot and 5 lost their lives. 9 years later, the Rouge was unionized. Wages began to rise. Because of their march, workers got a better life. And then it says, in memoriam to the 5 who died: Joe Bussell, Joe de Blasio, Coleman Lenny, Curtis Williams, and Joe York. And so that's in the phase 1 of the Fort Street Bridge Park. Of course, you mentioned now we're moving on to phase 2 of the Fort Street Bridge Park, which really focuses on the other half of the Fort Street Bridge Park, which is focused on the Rouge River and connecting people to the Rouge River and the recovery of the river, especially after the fire of 1969. I want to get more into this history. Well, you're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. My guest is Professor Paul Draus. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan-Dearborn and a board member with Friends of Rouge. The organization is working on the second phase of the Fort Street Bridge Park, which commemorates the Ford
Hunger March and for labor rights here in Michigan. And as you were just talking a little bit about that time, and I'm just thinking about the blueprint of unions across the country when we talk about auto factories and auto companies. How much of a blueprint is this for the beginning of unions that we see rising across the country?
Well, I mean, you had incidents like this that occurred across the United States. You know, my family's from Chicago. My grandfather was a part of the Memorial Day massacre, which occurred in Chicago, and I think even more people were killed there. This was also in the 1930s. So you had, as there were these sort of spasms of organizing and violence that, you know, eventually led to the formation of these unions that we now recognize today as sort of fixtures, you know, of our institutional landscape. But the United Auto Workers was not successful in organizing the Rouge plant until 1937.
9 years later.
Yeah, when the Battle of the Overpass took place. So that's actually 5 years later. So 1932 to 1937. Okay. But the Fort Hunger March was seen as a kind of a catalyzing event in terms of leading up to, because it sort of, you know, was a sort of chink in the armor of the Ford Motor Company. Yeah. I think the promise of people like Ford prior to that point was that Ford workers didn't need a union because they made good wages, they made above market wages, they were able to buy homes, they were able to buy the cars they built, and so on. And so this sort of promise, which is still kind of like the promise of American industry in a lot of ways, that, you know, you really don't need a union like Amazon. You don't need a union because they're going to give you
Amazon.
We're going to give you benefits right away. Of course, the reason why they're going to give you benefits is because the fact that jobs actually come with benefits today is as a result of unions, right? And so to keep unions out, then more companies, of course, would try to deliver some of the things that unions would promise if unions came in. So this is a very old kind of like tension and struggle. But yeah, the 1930s was a time when you saw a lot of these incidents because of what had happened with the economy and the sort of the kind of apparent failure of the free market model to address people's needs. And so this was, you know, the organizing, of course, is a long-term process, and the UAW was formed in not in Detroit, but I think in Lansing or Flint, actually in Flint, right, with the sit-down strike. But the organizing of the Rouge plant was in 1937.
Just such rich history. And I do want to go to a track. It's called Ford Massacre by John Langford and John Szymanski. It was released just last year. They did this performance live, and it just is commemorating the Ford Massacre.
So there's a story behind that, too.
Detroit to Dearborn, to the Ford Motor Company. March the 7th, 1932, a day that lives in infamy. 5,000 workers on a hunger march. Give us bread, not crumbs. Let's call it what it is.
So when I first heard the song, and I thought, you know, this is such an important part of history for a lot of people. So give us the background of the song.
So John Langford is a songwriter based in Chicago, who I knew from living in Chicago, and has been an outspoken advocate of workers' rights and so on for many years. He's from Wales originally, and which has its own sort of, you know, history of kind of labor organizing and so on. And so he's come out here a couple times to perform at our March On events, because he just believed in kind of helping to tell the story. And this was at a time when we were raising money for the park. We didn't have a park yet. And so this song that he wrote with John Szymanski, and they performed it virtually because this was still during the pandemic when we did the event virtually. And the chorus there is, let's call it what it is. So he's actually reclaiming the original name of the Ford Hunger March, which was the Ford Massacre. So in the papers after the event happened, it was actually called the Ford Massacre. So it was also called the Ford Hunger March. And I think part of his point was that calling it the Ford Hunger March kind of, you know, softens it a little bit from the being, you know, actually a massacre of where 5 people were killed. And so that's a song that John and John wrote. Actually, as to this date, I think unreleased, but we have the copy that they shared with us, the video, and the which you could post. It's on the Downriver Delta Facebook page, which I should mention. Downriver Delta Community Development Corporation is another partner on the 4th Street Bridge Park, along with Friends of the Rouge and the Fort Rouge Gateway Partnership, which is really a coalition of organizations I'm also on the board of Downriver Delta, so I should mention them.
So we have about 2 minutes or so to go. I do want you, before we go, describe the park for us. What's the first, once it is completed, the first phase is completed, and that second phase is completed, what's your vision for the overall project once it's completed?
So the first phase is completed. It was completed in 2020, and so we then started working on getting the resources to do phase 2. So the vision was always that the park would be both sort of backward-looking and forward-looking in the sense that it commemorates this history, but also connects it to our present day. So it commemorates the history of not just the labor history struggle, but also the environmental struggle, because the Rouge River notably caught fire in 1969. This was also a catalyzing moment in the creation of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Agency and so on, and the environmental movement and Earth Day and all this in the 1970s. And so this was kind of a spark, pun intended, that brought about like the modern environmental movement. So we kind of try to bring those two things together around that actual piece of land right on the Rouge River, which is still a heavily industrialized area, but also the Rouge River is improving markedly thanks to the efforts of organizations like Friends of the Rouge. And so we're trying to reconnect people back to the river. And people have retained a connection to the river there. So there's a fishing spot that people have been using for generations right there next to the bridge. And so in this second phase of the 4th Street Bridge Park, there will be a universally accessible kayak launch, but also a brand new fishing pier and observing deck. People can watch the Great Lakes freighters go through there that are still going up the river to bring the ore and to take products out of the Rouge plant just up the river.
I mean, I just love talking history. I love talking about the things that we're hoping to see really soon, and just making sure that people still have the connection to what was there in the city of Detroit.
Right. So that's why the interpretive signs are there. The sculpture is there. The poem that I read earlier is there. The other side of the sculpture has a small poem that talks about the history of the Rouge River. But yeah, we hope that it's a place that will pull people in, not just because of the history and they want to learn about the history. A lot of people come because they want to connect to the river. And so people are there to enjoy the river, and then maybe they'll connect to the history. So whatever way people come in, I should note that we also have native plant gardens and so beautiful plantings there. They're supposed to demonstrate, the ability of native plantings to help us sort of deal with our water issues in the urban water cycle. We have a rain garden, we have porous pavers. They're all meant to illustrate the ability of sort of green infrastructure or rain gardens to help us deal with some of the crises we're facing today with flooding and flood risk and so on. So it's also educational in that respect. So I'm a professor, right? We're always trying to educate people, but engage people at the same time. And hopefully, I'm fingers crossed that our water is supposed to be turned back on this week because of the work being done on phase 2. And so our frog water feature hopefully will be reactivated again. It's been shut down for a couple of years because of an issue with the water system underground. But we have an interactive water feature at the 4th Street Bridge Park Phase 1 where you can come and push a button and there's 6 frogs that spout water into the center of the park.
And the weather's going to hold up quite nicely for the family if you want to take your family out there.
Exactly. And soon people will be able to fish and canoe and kayak there once again. We apologize to all our fisher folk that don't have their spot currently, but we're hoping that it's going to be a spot that everybody will embrace and love, and more people will come to enjoy the river.
Thank you so much to Paul Draus, a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan-Dearborn and a member of the Friends of Rouge board. Professor Draus, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Of course. And a note, some WDET news and programming staff are a part of UAW Local 1979 Administrative Union at Wayne State University. Coming up, what role does art and the artist play in growing a community's economy? We'll revisit a conversation with Detroit muralist Sidney James and learn more. Stay right there. This is The Metro. We'll be right back.